The sun beat down hard on the frontier town, bleaching the clapboard buildings and kicking up dust that stung the eyes. Wagons rattled over rutted streets, and the smell of sweat, horses, and stale whiskey drifted in the air. It was the kind of place where mercy had no place, where every man looked out for himself, and the weak were left to fend or perish alone. Down the main street, among the busy noise of barter and gossip, a figure moved slowly, almost ghost-like. She was thin, too thin, her frame draped in a dress that had once been decent but was now little more than rags. A widow, her face pale beneath the dirt, hollow cheeks showing the marks of hunger. Her hands trembled as she clutched a worn shawl around her shoulders, though it did little to hide the sharpness of her bones. The townsfolk noticed her, and instead of pity, their eyes narrowed with disdain. A shopkeeper muttered as she passed, "Begging again, is she?" A ranch hand, lounging against a post, let out a mocking whistle. "Careful, boys. She'll eat you out of house and home if you give her a crumb." Laughter followed, sharp and cruel, echoing down the street louder than the rattle of wagon wheels. The widow's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Hunger had stolen her strength. Pride had silenced her voice. She lowered her head, her tangled hair falling like a veil, and kept walking, each step slower than the last. Children pointed, giggling at the sight of her bare feet dusted with dirt. A woman shook her head, pulling her son close as though poverty were a sickness that might spread. By the saloon doors, a man spat into the dirt and sneered. "Her man's been dead near a year and she's still hanging on. Can't even die proper." More laughter followed, the kind that cut deeper than any blade. The widow stopped, swaying on her feet. For a heartbeat, it seemed she might fall right there in the dust. But she straightened, thin shoulders trembling, and forced herself forward. She had nothing. No family, no home, not even a crust of bread. And yet here she stood, mocked by those who had plenty, condemned for the crime of being hungry and alone. In that moment, the town showed its true face, hard, merciless, blind to suffering. A place where cruelty was entertainment, and compassion was a language long forgotten. Before the hunger, before the rags and the whispers, she had once been a wife with a roof over her head and a man to share the weight of the world. Her husband, a quiet ranch hand with strong shoulders, had worked long days to keep food on the table. Their cabin stood at the edge of the valley, modest but warm, with a small garden and the steady comfort of a fire at night. It wasn't much by the town's standards, but it was enough for them. Then came the fever, sudden, merciless, and quick. Within a week her husband was gone, laid in the cold ground beneath a cedar cross she carved herself. The garden withered soon after, and with no one to help work the land, the cabin became a hollow shell. When debt collectors came to claim what little she had, she was driven off her own land, forced to wander the dusty streets of town with nothing but a shawl and the memory of a life she could never reclaim. The hunger crept in slowly, gnawing at her ribs until it was a constant ache. She learned to survive on scraps, half-eaten biscuits left on saloon tables, wilted vegetables discarded behind the mercantile. Some nights she went without anything at all, curling up in an alley while her stomach twisted in pain. Worse than hunger was the shame. Each time she reached for a scrap, she felt the eyes of the town on her, judging, condemning her for falling so low. The townsfolk's cruelty wasn't born only of meanness, but of prejudice. In a hard land, weakness was despised. To them she was a burden, a reminder of how quickly fortune could turn to dust. No one dared help her, not openly. Charity, in their eyes, invited scorn from others, a sign of softness in a place where hardness meant survival. Women whispered that she had cursed her husband to an early grave, then muttered that she should remarry or leave, anything but haunt their streets like a shadow. Children mocked her bare feet and tattered dress, repeating the sneers of their parents. Every insult carved another wound, but none so deep as the loneliness. Still she endured. Each day she rose. Each night she found a corner to sleep, refusing to vanish though the world willed her gone. She carried her grief in silence, her hunger without complaint. The widow bore it all because in her heart, fragile as it was, flickered a stubborn ember that would not go out. The widow thought she had grown used to whispers and sidelong glances, but that morning the cruelty sharpened into something louder, something that left no space to hide. She had paused in the street near the well, her thin hands trembling as she reached for a cup of water. Dust clung to her torn skirt, her face pale from hunger. That was when the laughter began. Two merchants leaning by the hitching post called out, mocking her sunken cheeks and the way she stumbled on bare feet. "Careful, boys," one sneered. "Looks like a ghost come back for supper." Another spat in the dirt, saying she belonged more with the coyotes than among decent folk. Their jeers drew the attention of others, and soon a small crowd gathered, eager for spectacle. Then came the sheriff, swaggering down the boardwalk with his star glinting on his vest. He was a man who loved the sound of his own voice, and cruelty gave him an easy stage. Seeing the widow clutching her cup, he smirked. "Well now," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "ain't this a sight?" The mighty ranch hand's widow reduced to begging water like a stray dog. "Maybe we ought to toss her scraps in the street so she can fight the buzzards for 'em." The crowd roared with laughter. Some covered their mouths, others didn't bother. Each word from the sheriff was a lash, and the people joined in, emboldened by his authority. Children pointed and repeated his insults, mocking her ragged dress, the way her shoulders hunched. The widow stood frozen, her cup trembling in her hands. She tried to swallow her shame, but her throat tightened. Her eyes burned, though no tears fell. She had survived so much: loss, hunger, loneliness. But this public humiliation struck deeper than any pang of hunger. It stripped her dignity before the eyes of the very town she once belonged to. The sheriff leaned closer, his grin wide and merciless. "Tell you what," he drawled. "If you're so hungry for a man's name, why don't you marry the first drunk that'll have you? Might be the only way you keep from starving." His words rang across the square like a cruel bell. The widow's lips parted, but no sound came. The world seemed to tilt, the laughter echoing around her, pressing in until her knees threatened to give. She was on the verge of breaking, of collapsing under the weight of scorn. And all the while, the sheriff tipped his hat as if he'd just done the town a favor. The laughter carried down the street, sharp as broken glass. Most men passing by lowered their eyes, unwilling to risk the sheriff's wrath or the judgment of the crowd. But one figure slowed his horse at the edge of the square. A tall cowboy, broad-shouldered, dust from the trail still clinging to his hat and boots. He was a man the town didn't know well, a drifter who kept to himself, but his presence was impossible to ignore. He dismounted without a word, his spurs cutting through the noise like a warning bell. The crowd's laughter faltered, curiosity pricking at their bravado. He walked with the steady confidence of a man who'd faced harder things than taunts, his eyes fixed not on the sheriff, but on the trembling widow. Her hands shook as she clutched her cup, and the sheriff, noticing the cowboy's approach, smirked wider. "What's this? Another fool come to gawk?" he jeered. The cowboy stopped a step away from the widow and slowly pulled his worn trail coat from his shoulders. Without hesitation, he draped it over her thin frame. The fabric swallowed her, but for the first time in months, she felt warmth not born of fire, but of human kindness. Gasps rippled through the crowd. No one had dared lift her up until now. The sheriff's grin stiffened. "You best take care where you stand, stranger," he warned, his hand brushing the edge of his belt. "Ain't wise to make a joke of the law." The cowboy finally turned his gaze on him, eyes steady as the horizon. His voice was low, calm, but it carried like thunder in the hushed square. "She's no joke. She's a woman who's had enough taken from her. If you can't see that, then maybe you're the fool." Murmurs stirred among the onlookers. The sheriff's face flushed, but the cowboy didn't flinch. He reached for the widow's trembling hand, steadying it in his calloused grip. "Stand tall," he told her gently. "They only laugh 'cause they're afraid to feel. Don't let their shame become yours." For the first time, her chin lifted, just enough to meet his eyes. There was no pity there, only recognition, one wounded soul to another. The sheriff sputtered, his authority bruised by the simple act of defiance. Yet the cowboy didn't stay to argue. He simply placed himself between the widow and the crowd, daring anyone to cross him. The square, moments ago alive with cruel laughter, fell into uneasy silence. In that silence, the cowboy's humanity spoke louder than any insult. With nothing more than a coat and a steady hand, he had turned mockery into shame and planted the seed of something stronger than fear. The square still hummed with unease. The sheriff glaring, the townsfolk whispering. Dust swirled between boots and wagon wheels, but no one dared break the silence. The widow clutched the coat around her shoulders, as if it were armor against the cruelty of the world. She stood trembling, caught between disbelief and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, someone saw her as more than a shadow. The cowboy shifted, squaring himself against the crowd. His voice carried with quiet authority, stronger than the sheriff's bluster. "She's under my protection now." The words landed like iron. People blinked, unsure if they had heard right. The sheriff scoffed, trying to regain ground. "You can't just claim some beggar woman like a stray mutt. This town don't need another mouth to feed." The cowboy's jaw tightened, but his gaze never wavered. "She's no stray. She's got a name, and from this day on she carries mine." Gasps rippled through the square. A rancher's wife covered her mouth. A boy tugged at his father's sleeve, whispering questions. Even the merchants fell silent. To offer a woman his name was no small thing. It was to give her not only shelter but dignity, belonging. A place in a world that had tried to cast her out. The widow's knees nearly buckled. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the hard lines of the sheriff, the gawking faces of the crowd. She pressed her hand to her lips as if holding back a cry. All the hunger, the humiliation, the lonely nights in the alleys, it all cracked open in that single moment. Someone had chosen her. Someone had seen her worth when no one else would. The sheriff tried to sneer, but his voice faltered. "You don't know what you're taking on, stranger." The cowboy turned, steady as stone. "I know enough. I know she deserves better than your laughter." For the first time, the widow spoke, her voice shaking but strong enough to reach the ears of every soul present. "Thank you." It was little more than a whisper, but it held the weight of all the silence she had endured. The square remained hushed, shame prickling through those who had jeered only minutes before. No one dared laugh now. They had witnessed something rare. Honor made flesh in the shape of a cowboy who gave away the only treasure that mattered in a hard land. His name. The widow's tears fell freely, but they were no longer born of despair. They were the tears of a woman who, for the first time since her husband's death, felt the strength of belonging. And in that dusty street, under the sheriff's stunned silence, the cowboy's vow turned cruelty into reverence. The crowd's whispers faded as the cowboy led the widow from the square, his arm steady at her side. The sheriff's glare burned into their backs, but no one stepped forward to stop them. For the first time in countless months, she walked not as a beggar or an outcast, but as a woman under protection. The coat around her shoulders no longer felt borrowed. It felt like a shield, like belonging. They reached the edge of town where his horse waited, stamping at the dust. The cowboy helped her into the saddle with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his rugged frame. Then he mounted behind, reins in one hand, the other steadying her. The town and its cruelty fell behind them with every hoofbeat, swallowed by the vast sweep of prairie and the glow of the sinking sun. The ride was quiet, but it wasn't the silence of loneliness she had known before. This silence was steady like a promise. She could feel the warmth of his coat, the strength of the man who had faced down the whole town on her behalf. Each mile carried her further from shame, closer to something she had thought forever lost: safety. When the stars began to scatter across the sky, they stopped at a rise overlooking the open plains. The cowboy built a small fire, its light pushing back the chill of evening. He handed her a plate of beans and cornbread from his saddlebag. It was simple food, yet to her it tasted richer than any banquet. For once she ate without feeling eyes on her, without hearing cruel laughter. Across the flames the cowboy sat quietly, his hat tipped low, the firelight softening the stern lines of his face. He didn't speak much, but he didn't need to. She knew deep down that his word carried more weight than 100 empty speeches. He had given her not just food, not just warmth, but dignity. Tears welled again, though this time they were gentle, born of gratitude rather than despair. She whispered his name, testing the sound of it on her tongue, realizing it was now her own as well. And as the fire crackled and the night stretched wide, the truth settled over her like the stars above. Sometimes the greatest gift is not riches, not land, not gold, but a name spoken with honor.